Now we begin part 2 of Plutarch's life of Pompey, pertaining to the fall of the Roman Republic. We know that the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, but I think it would be wrong to say that the Roman Republic was conquered. Wrong to think of the dictatorship as the implementation of force over an unpersuaded multitude. It's closer to say that the Roman people rebelled against republican rule. They preferred a dictatorship centered around a populist leader of whom they approved. This was a popular rejection of republicanism. We like to think of revolutions as being against authoritarian regimes to install democracies. This preference, I think, is why we do not call this a revolution. It also did not call itself a revolution. It called itself a civil war. But the consul of Rome was defeated by force of arms and replaced by the man who beat him, and the government substantially altered thereafter. If that's not a revolution, I'm not sure what is. But just remember, as this starts, Pompey and Caesar are allies as this begins. Caesar is made consul in 59 BC. Plutarch writes, Caesar, being thus elected consul, began at once to make an interest with the poor and meaner sort by preferring and establishing laws for planting colonies and dividing lands. Caesar's co-consul Bibulus opposed this bill, at which Caesar brought forth Pompey and asked Pompey, in case any man should offer violence to these laws, will you be ready to give your assistance to the people? Yes, replied Pompey. Pompey filled the city with soldiers. They threw a vessel of ordure, which means shit, on Bibulus, the consul, in the forum, and a fracas ensued. Those laws were enacted. Plutarch writes, they got their bill for the division of lands established and passed into an act, and not only so, but the whole populace, being taken with this bait, became totally at their devotion, inquiring into nothing, and without a word giving their suffrages to whatever they propounded. Bibulus spent 8 months within doors, despite being consul. This is the guy who doesn't want to go out anymore because he doesn't want ordure shit dumped on him. At the end of Caesar's consulship, he returns to Gaul. The tribune Clodius mocked Pompey to the people in public, to great snickering. This is the first time Pompey sees genuine disapproval. Pompey is accused of becoming effeminate with his new young wife. But Caesar's star is rising. Plutarch writes, Caesar grew great and famous with his wars in Gaul. Spoils and treasure which he took from the enemy in his conquests, he sent to Rome in presents, tempting people with his gifts. When Caesar returns from Gaul, he arranges for Crassus and Pompey to become consuls and acquires his further appointment in Gaul. They get him an additional appointment. To this end, Pompey lends him 4 legions. It must be reminded, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, they're allies at this point in their triumvirate. Now, we have addressed what happens next in the life of Crassus. He's off to Syria. Now, 2 things happen that are important for this alliance. First, Pompey has been married to Caesar's daughter. After an altercation during a public assembly, there is killing in the streets, and Pompey finds himself covered in blood. His young wife, pregnant, sees this and swoons. She miscarries and dies. This severs the family tie between Caesar and Pompey. Next, news comes from the east that Crassus is dead. The triumvirate is done. Now let us pause here for a moment. First, I think we can surmise without much trouble that Caesar was more personally adept at winning people over than Pompey was. He is not the first person to figure out that people like gifts, right? Clearly there was something more to it. Pompey was a good general, but he may have been a dreadful politician. And we also must wonder at Crassus. Between Pompey and Caesar, his military accomplishments are pretty pitiful, Crassus's are. So we must assume, therefore, that all things considered, he may have been the superior politician between the 3, not necessarily in the sense of achieving popularity, but in the art of acquiring the allegiance of the senates. And I think an American analogy can almost be made of Pompey to being kind of like an Eisenhower, Crassus to being something of a Nixon, and Caesar to Kennedy, Cato, the stubborn stoic Goldwater, Cicero, the Joseph McCarthy with his Catalanarian conspiracy linking all sorts of names with that threat to the city. Secondly, was the fall of the Republic possible without the disaster in Turkey? Now, this is a coulda, woulda, shoulda, but it's worth thinking about. Crassus lost an army of 30,000 Roman soldiers in that campaign. Plutarch writes, the death of Crassus, by which another safeguard against civil war was removed, since both Caesar and Pompey kept their eyes on Crassus, and awe of him held them together more or less within the bounds of fair dealing all his lifetime. Okay, now things come to a head. The city now at once began to roll and swell, so to say, with the stir of the coming storm. Things everywhere were in a state of agitation, and everybody's discourse tended to division. The result is that Pompey is made sole consul and he is supported by Cato. Plutarch describes Pompey as showing some favor to his friends, but generally a good leader in the city's legal life. But Caesar's allies in Rome argue that Caesar should be allowed to stand for consul despite being absent, because he's off in Gaul. Remember, Caesar is off in Gaul. Pompey argued on behalf of Caesar in the Senate, as it were out of kindness to Caesar, to plead his cause and allay any jealousy that was conceived against him. But Cato's party withstood this, and Pompey's making no rejoinder, but letting it pass as a matter in which he was overruled, increased the suspicion of his real feelings towards Caesar. Things are tense in Rome, I think you can say. Presently also, under the pretense of a war with Parthia, he sent for his 2 legions he had lent him. That's Pompey requesting 2 legions he had sent to Caesar. He's requesting them back, as Caesar's off in Gaul. However, Caesar, though he well knew why they were asked for, sent them home very liberally rewarded. The next thing is that Pompey comes into a false sense of security and popularity when the whole of Italy prays for his recovery while he is sick. He comes down with a sickness. Everybody's praying for him. And there's a great deal of feasting and drinking and all this in celebration of him getting better. Now, I think there's an easy lesson here. Never be under the impression that people like you if they use you as an excuse to drink. How many times do we promise things to each other when we're drunk that never come to fruition? But Pompey's hangover comes with disillusionment as to this false popularity. Mark Antony and Curio, Caesar's men, come to Rome and make a motion in the Senate that there should be a vote to the better option. As you know, there's a standoff going on here. So they bring a vote to the Senate between 2 choices: that Caesar should disband his army, or that both Caesar and Pompey should disband their armies. More of the Senate is in favor of total disarmament. This vote, of course, had no actual effect, but was the design of Caesar's allies to demonstrate that the Senate actually didn't really take a side in this coming civil war. But it doesn't really matter. The consul Pharsalus tasks Pompey with the job of defending Rome in the event of an attack by Caesar. But here are the words of Plutarch. Pompey began to make his levies. He found himself disappointed in his expectations. Some few, indeed, came in, but those very unwillingly. Others would not answer to their names. And the generality cried out for peace. Rome is a sitting duck, crying out for peace. It is not long after this that Caesar makes his move. He came to the banks of the Rubicon. There he made a halt, pausing a little, and considering, we may suppose, with himself, the greatness of the enterprise which he had undertaken. Then, at last, like men that are throwing themselves headlong from some precipice into a vast abyss, having shut, as it were, his mind's eyes, and put away from his sight the idea of danger, he merely uttered to those near him the Greek words, "Ineripto kubos," meaning, "Let the die be cast." And he led his army through the river. No sooner was the news arrived, but there was an uproar throughout all the city, and a consternation in the people, even to astonishment, such as never was known in Rome before. Now consider these lines about the city. Those that were without came from all parts, flocking into the city, and they who were within, seeing the confusion and disorder so great there, all good things impotent, and disobedience and insubordination, grown too strong to be controlled by the magistrates, were quitting it as fast as others came in. Every man pressed and urged him, that is Pompey, according to his particular fancy, whether it proceeded from doubt, fear, grief, or any meaner passion. And then this next part, I think, is a little explanatory. It was impossible to have any good intelligence of the enemy for what each man heard by chance upon a flying rumor he would report for the truth. Now, it is in this environment that Pompey leaves Rome. He evacuates. And Plutarch says he declared that whosoever tarried behind should be judged a confederate of Caesar's. He doesn't trust what he hears. I think that is what this tells us. The word that comes to mind for me is that Rome has been compromised. When we consider the flatteries that reached Pompey, the rewards we know Caesar paid to the legions that he sent him, we see a compromised Rome. All the lines in this biography tend to Caesar's acquisition of support via gift and a very quiet shift in mood. Caesar's support had crept in. In this story, it is not just a power grab. For Pompey himself, this seems to have been a complete disillusionment. To see how much of his popularity was feigned, how much of it was linked merely to his allegiance and alliance with Caesar, and how much of Caesar's popularity was real. When we consider his flight from Brundisium, Brundisium is the city at the end of the Italian boot. It's a port city where Pompey erected palisades and fortifications in order to block his rear guard as he flees. As we read that the Brundisians themselves showed Caesar the way around these fortifications. They showed him how to get through. So we see a people that Pompey comes through. They do as they're told. He tells them to dig trenches in the city to make it difficult for Caesar. Yes, sir. No, sir. No excuse, sir. But as soon as Pompey leaves, they're all pro-Caesar. This is where he went. We'll help you track him down. He made it out of Italy in the nick of time. That the people of Italy preferred Caesar to Pompey must have been socially palpable in most of Pompey's interactions. He must have sensed it. These days and weeks transformed the sole consul of Rome and commander of all the seas into a foreign enemy in his own country. I don't know how else you can interpret this complete alteration in the course of history. This guy has had more power than anyone in Rome, really. Then all of a sudden, he's fleeing, not just Rome. He wasn't safe in Italy. He had to flee like a rat from a force of 5,000 foot under Caesar. 5,000 foot, 300 horse. 5,000 foot soldiers. These people, to put that in perspective, Victoria Stadium in England could have accommodated them to watch the Manchester United reserve team play. They could have fit Caesar's whole army. They chased the government out of Rome with that. Something is wrong in order for that to be possible. And I want to compare this 5,000 person conquering of Italy with something that Alexander Hamilton said in 1781 in the Continentalist number 111. Hamilton complains, "Our whole system is in disorder, our currency depreciated. The government in its present condition unable to command the means to pay, clothe, or feed their troops. The enemy making an alarming progress in the southern states, lately in complete possession of 2 of them." Hamilton continues, "We ought to blush to acknowledge that this is a true picture of our situation when we reflect that the enemy's whole force in the United States, including their American levies and their late reinforcement, is little more than 14,000 effective men." He goes on to say, "Nothing but a general disaffection of the people or mismanagement in their rulers can account for the figure we make and for the distresses and perplexities we experience contending against so small a force." And indeed, as we assess this moment in the life of Pompey, 5,000 troops under Caesar, enough to eradicate the government and to chase the Senate and the consul out of Rome, the great Roman Republic. Clearly, something is wrong, and I think we can agree with Hamilton's assessment when so small a force is capable of this. The explanation must be a general disaffection of the people or a mismanagement of their rulers, and I think in this case we have both. I mean, Plutarch tells us that the message had gone out from Pompey requesting reinforcements from Spain. The fact that he chose not to wait in Brundisium, despite being well fortified there, tells you that he was unwilling to rely on the support of anyone who wasn't right there telling him, "I'm with you." It tells us that Pompey's authority had lost its legitimacy. Now, Napoleon once said that in war, morale is everything. Pompey's morale could hardly have been lower, as we will see, and he will never gain it quite back. So Pompey sails to Syria and raises a great army. Caesar chases him, and both armies wind up maneuvering around Greece, around the port of Oricum, and then there's a report of a handful of skirmishes. This is interesting too. The situation was that Caesar was so hemmed in both by seas and land that he was forced to desire battle, daily provoking the enemy and assailing them in their very forts, and in these light skirmishes, for the most part, had the better. Once only he, as in Caesar, was dangerously overthrown and was within a little of losing his whole army. Pompey, having fought nobly, routing the whole force and killing 2,000 on the spot, but either he was not able or was afraid to go on and force his way into the camp. What is the matter with Pompey? It's like Caesar's in his head. It's like those words of Lucullus are in his head. You don't have any accomplishments. Remember what Lucullus told him back in the last one? You've never conquered anybody. You beat pirates. And you arrive to feast on the dead body of an enemy after someone else has done the work. As the campaign continues in Greece, Pompey has Caesar hemmed in again, but Pompey was firmly resolved with himself not to give him battle, but rather to besiege and distress him by keeping close at his heels. But then Plutarch tells us that Pompey was harangued by the men in his camp to get rid of Caesar, and thus they forced him to break his measures, and the day of battle comes. So already, Pompey didn't even want to fight this major battle because we're coming up with the Battle of Pharsalus. This is the great battle between Pompey and Caesar. Pompey doesn't even want to fight this. He wants to let Caesar starve. This guy's been avoiding the fight. He doesn't want this fight. The day of battle comes. Caesar, observing the left wing of the enemy to be lined and fortified with such a mighty guard of horse, and alarmed at the gallantry of their appearance, sent for a detachment of 6 cohorts out of the reserves. All right. So he sees the line and says, those guys look tough. Now he talks, the commands that he sends to his cohorts are commanding them not to stir, but when the enemy's horse should begin to charge, they should make up with all speed to the front and not throw their javelins, but they should strike them upwards into the eyes and faces of the enemy. On Pompey's end, Plutarch writes, Pompey on horseback was viewing the order of both armies, and when he saw how well the enemy kept their ranks, expecting quietly the signal of battle, and on the contrary, how impatient and unsteady his own men were, waving up and down in disorder for want of experience. All right, it's come to it at last, and Pompey and his men are not up to it. There's a reason Pompey didn't want to engage. He knows his men have less morale, his men have less experience, and for some reason, Caesar's men, they're hemmed in around this cause. They believe in Caesar. Now, I wonder if the 30,000 soldiers under Crassus would have come in handy here. I wonder. In any case, the trumpets sound, the armies bash and batter away at each other. Plutarch philosophizes as he tells us about the spectacle. The whole flower and strength of the same single city here meeting in collision with itself offered plain proof how blind and how mad a thing human nature is when once possessed with any passion. The philosophy of Plutarch. Now some trivia for military history. The name of the centurion in command of the first company under Caesar to move was Caius Cassianus. And he fought well until someone skewered him through the mouth of the face out the back of the skull. But let's get to some of the great lines here. So Pompey's horse, they attack and they lose to that cohort. And then here are the lines of Pompey seeing this. When Pompey, by the dust flying in the air, conjectured the fate of his horse, it were very hard to say what his thoughts or intentions were, but looking like one distracted and beside himself, and without any recollection or reflection that he was Pompey the Great, he retired slowly towards his camp, without speaking a word to any man, exactly according to the description in the verses. And this must be something from Homer, or I don't know, who knows. But Jove from heaven struck Ajax with a fear. Ajax the bold then stood astonished there, flung o'er his back the mighty sevenfold shield, and trembling gazed and spied about the field. So Pompey loses. And after the battle, Caesar enters Pompey's camp, and what he sees there is a lavish camp. One that does not look like they were ready for battle, but was confidently expecting victory with wine jugs and prepared celebrations. And there's a description just after this as Pompey flees. He has to rely on the charity of a merchant who recognizes him in order to ferry him around the Mediterranean. And there's something about the anecdote There must have been something harrowing for Pompey to have to rely on another person's charity for the safety of his own person, knowing full well that while this man does help him, that may not be the attitude taken by everybody that Pompey meets, and that's going to wind up being the case. Pompey is no longer capable of tending to the safety of his own person and family. And so there's a sort of sense of foreboding here, and that's exactly what it should be. And from here we get some other lines. When Pompey goes to the town of Mytilene, there's an exchange with a philosopher named Cratippus, and Plutarch says that the philosopher modestly declined any dispute in order to put Pompey in better hopes, so he doesn't argue with him about anything. So Plutarch decides to insert what the philosopher should have said. Here's what Plutarch says: that he might have demonstrated the necessity there was that the commonwealth should be turned into a monarchy because of their ill government in the state. Isn't that interesting? Could it be said that the republic wasn't working? So that's more for a larger debate. Next, we're getting to the end here. Pompey goes to Egypt, and as he gets to the city of Pelusium, he has to weigh anchor and sit there at his boat while the counselors around King Ptolemy of Egypt decide what is to be done. And of course, as we know, they're in there deciding to kill him. But apparently there are contrary arguments, and they have to come to this decision. But Ptolemy, of course, is just a child. The person who's truly holding the reins of state is this guy Pothinus. And Plutarch writes, "It was indeed a miserable thing that the fate of the great Pompey should be left to the determinations of Pothinus, the eunuch." Eunuchs are men with their balls chopped off, close advisors to kings and queens. And so they decide to kill him, and he goes to the shore, even though it seems clear that their intent is not so great. These are lines that are later on. They began to suspect the meanness of their entertainment and gave warning to Pompey. These are the people close to Pompey. But it doesn't matter. He heads towards the shore, and he is killed. To pick up the story of the fall of the Republic, we are going to have to turn to Plutarch's Life of Caesar, perhaps Plutarch's Life of Antony, and then the historian Cassius Dio.